I am Greg Daniil, licensed professional counselor, state of Missouri, Covenant grad. I'm also, I have a certificate in grief and death studies. Tell me that sounds really exciting. And that's with Alan Wolfelt, who actually wrote many of those books that are back there. So I'm very mentored by him. But when I was at seminary, one of the things I learned was know your author. Before you sit down and read something, know where this person's coming from. I feel the same way about people who speak. Know your speaker. So yeah, I've got great academics. However, what's really important is I got involved in grief work because in 1998, my 17-year-old son died in a car accident. And talk about changing your world. That was it. That was profound grief. And I found profound grief changes you profoundly. And so at that particular time in my quest for help, I found very little help. So as I walked through things, and I met Alan, he was great help to me. I decided to become a part of the solution instead of a part of the problem. That's why I went back to school and I became a licensed professional counselor. I gave up my IT business, because this is an area where help is really needed. So that's why I do what I do. So now you know a little bit about me. I would like to bring up as well that Kaleo Counseling Center also has a subdivision of it, if you will, called the Hope Center for Grief and Life Losses. I want you to pay attention to that. Grief and life losses. We're going to talk more about that, but that's why it's specifically named that. And yes, so let me also introduce Mark, my associate, who I'm so glad to be here with. He's a great guy. Mark.
Good to be with you guys. Mark Joyner. About 5 years ago, I started this process of second career in seeking counseling as a second career. And the really kind of part of my story is being a widower. 2009, my wife passed away of cancer. And so that began, of course, that I didn't sign up for and didn't anticipate. It was probably the hardest. It was the hardest thing I've gone through. And so, short story is that's why I'm here today. Is I found someone to help me through that process. And so this in the whole moving careers, changing careers, this seemed like the next best step for me. And it's been a good fit. And I really enjoy sitting with people and just walking with them through hard times as well. And so I've had the privilege to work with Greg the last couple of years, specifically with grief, but other things as well, marriage and whatnot. So, but yeah, honored to be with you guys. And hopefully, if anything else, that you leave here with more courage than you walked in here with. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, thanks for coming today. It takes brave people to walk into a seminar about grief. So I want to commend each one of you for your bravery to be here. So today is about the basics. Next time we get together, it'll be about more of the healing process. But grief is so misunderstood. We need to take the time to really understand what is grief about. So I'm going to start with one premise, and the premise is this: loss will happen, and grief is the normal response. Loss will happen, and grief is the normal response. More on how it will happen, and I know it will happen. It will happen to all of us, in different ways. Okay, different parts of that spectrum. But what I wanted to focus on for an opening here was, and it's the normal response. There's lots of problems, I think, in our society, in our social settings, that grief doesn't get treated like the normal response to a loss. It's almost looked at as being somehow abnormal. But the reality is, grief is the normal response. So how did that happen? How did grief get a bad name, if you will? Well, there's a lot of factors that I think fed into that. One of those is we are in a society that is dominated by the medical model of man and woman. So what do I mean by that? Let's talk about medical model. there's many parts to us is what this is all about. There's a medical part to us, but that's not all. There's an emotional part to us. There's a spiritual part to us. There's very many different parts, but what's the one that just gets all the attention in our society? It's the medical model. You can look at commercials, like it's all about, for more often than not, the medical model is what kind of rules when we talk about human beings. Well, what is the message in the medical model? If you have pain, that means something is wrong. So if that's what the medical model represents, if the medical model is kind of in charge of much of our social understanding, interpersonal understanding, that means we're really sitting with a message that says, if something hurts, it's wrong. Now apply that to grief. Grief is going to hurt. We've lost something precious, something important. It's going to have pain. It's going to have sadness. That's a part of it. So by implication, then, that means it must be wrong. If you're really pressed into certain parts of our society, there's parts that if you're not happy, what's wrong with you? We're not going to all be happy all the time. That's kind of like a formula for failures. That's your goal. There are things that Thomas Kempis, I think, did the best. He's a theologian from the 1500s, rather. And he said this: there are times for appropriate sorrows of the soul. There are times. So I'm not saying we all need to be grieving all the time about everything and we need to be sad all the time, but there are times when we do have to give it its due. But sometimes we're with people and with social settings and messages that say, no, don't give it anything. Because if you do, that's wrong. So I'm here to say it's not wrong. I lost my son. His name is Jeremy, by the way. So if you hear me say Jeremy, that's what I'm talking about. Okay? That made me sad. What's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. I loved him. So loss will happen, but grief is the normal response. Even our insurance companies do a great job of telling us it's not normal. If you came to see me, if you were on insurance, I must give you a diagnosis. They used to have a diagnosis for bereavement. That is now gone. I must now give you what's called an adjustment disorder. Well, that sounds bad, doesn't it? That's wrong. You've got an adjustment disorder. No, you don't. You have a normal response to an abnormal situation that somebody got. So our insurance companies don't help. Our society in general does not help. I've already touched on that, right? If you're sad, it's wrong. If something hurts, it's wrong. We don't want to deal with the sadness and hurt. Let's all just be happy. Let's all be happy. Most of these avoidant messages do this. It prevents you from being what's called an active participant in your own grief. What I learned was you have to actively engage with your grief. Let's think about that in general. If you avoid something, what happens? Even in the medical model, if you avoid something, it has a tendency to get worse, doesn't it? I used to think the best thing for my car, if there was a problem, was to avoid it because then it'll just fix itself. That did not work, just so you know. I think I replaced an engine one time based on that. So it's not about avoidance. It's about, let's acknowledge it. Let's work with it. I'm going to give you more on that as we go forward, because that's actually the path to healing. Acknowledging it and working with it. But most of the messages are about avoiding. All right. I'll give you more on that later too. So what is the point here? The point is, when we have a loss, what we've lost is normal. Normal is gone. Normal for me was to have my son sitting at the dining room table. That was normal. When he left, I lost normal, and I can't get it back. Well, the only thing I can do is work with the grief to transition to a point that I'm in, and I'm going to use the term new normal. I hate that term, just so you know. It's way overused. Clinically, I would use a different kind of term, but that's what we kind of know and understand. It's to find this new normal, and we're going to talk about that as well. So grief is just going to happen. It's going to show up. So we got to do something with it. Well, then we better have a good definition for grief. There's two kinds of grief. One of those we know. As soon as you say grief, what do you think? Oh, somebody died. Right? But there's two kinds of griefs. There's death grief. There's life loss grief. Those are two. They are both griefs. They both have to do with loss, but one has to do with the departure of another human being that's profoundly important in your life. Life losses has to do with something changed in my life. I am also a survivor of a divorce. That was a life loss. No body died. Something did die, a relationship. So as we go through all this, I just want to keep that in mind. There's death loss and there's life losses. I would say most of what we're going to say today, probably 80% would be applicable to both. But there are nuances. There are nuances that have to do with grieving a divorce. I have one of my clients is a devout atheist. She knows I'm a Christian. And I ask her every once in a while, I say, so why do you keep coming to see me? You know who I am, and I know who you are. So why do you keep coming? She says, because when I came to you because of my divorce, you were the first person that told me maybe I need to grieve it. And you were right. You were right. So we used a lot of the grief understanding in her divorce situation. So that's life losses. Thus, the subsidiary of Kaleo, the Hope Center for Grief and Life Losses. We didn't put life losses in there. I think it would get lost. So there's two kinds of grief: death grief, life loss grief. My other life losses, I'm a cancer survivor, but that cancer's profoundly changed some aspects of my life. Oh, what did I have to do? I had to grieve, and then I had to transition. We're going to keep those terms together, right? Grief is ultimately about how do I transition. Also, I do like, I'm kind of downing our society, if you haven't noticed that already. There are some good things that are happening out there. People are becoming a little more, I think, truly grief aware. I've seen it in some shows recently. Like, holy cow, do they have grief counselors helping them write this episode? I'm really happy to see some of these good things coming out. There's some books out there, and here's how I know you will grieve. No matter who you're talking to, they will grieve. There's even a book out there called Necessary Losses. There's actually 2 or 3 variations of that book, and that's all about in order to develop in life, in order to step to that next stage of life, you must give something up in order to move forward. And that is a loss. I have a granddaughter who's going to turn 21. She, since the time she was about 18, has been saying, what is this adultify thing? Right? And she follows that up with, and I don't like it. I like what I had. For her to move to the more adult world, she has to give some things up, some naivete, getting all her money from her mom. She'll have to give some things up. Okay? She's going to have losses. So that's how I can say it so easily. I can say, well, everybody will have losses. So she and I actually have some great talks about grief. So that's, I think, a good definition for grief. You've lost something that means something to you. And I do want to be very careful here, though. Most of what I'm going to talk about is going to be about death grief, but there are nuances, for divorce and for other life losses. There's nuances in there we need to be aware of. So if you're here for any of those others, please take note. Maybe 80% of what I say is going to be good, and then the other things we're going to have other discussions about. We'll try to raise those up along the way, in some ways anyway. Grief is also not how it historically started. It historically started with a lady named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in the 1960s, late 50s, early 60s. She decided, well, I want to understand more about what this grief thing is. And she, and I love the 60s. I'm a product of the 60s. Lots of stuff came out of the 60s, including her. And so she wrote this book on death and dying after doing a lot of research. And she said there's 5 stages to grief. That applies to this day. People will talk about the 5 stages of grief. And on her deathbed, she actually said, you Americans, you took just what I meant to be as a way of categorizing something and you put it into some great linear order that is formalized that first you do denial, dabda. That's what the dabda is, denial. Then you do anger. Then you do bargaining. Well, I have to explain that. But then you do depression, and then you do acceptance. And she goes, I never meant that. It's a mess. It's a messy thing. Lots of things go on. So it's not the historical dabda. There are newer understandings that she was actually trying to get us to. We just did not do a good job of interpreting what she was trying to make happen. We don't call them stages anymore. We call them dimensions. There are many, many dimensions that shows up when we grieve. And they cover a lot of different areas. They cover our emotional area. There's a book back there by C.S. Lewis called A Grief Observed. Amazing book. If you were not grieving, if you had never grieved profoundly, you read that book, you'd go, what's wrong with this guy? Because he was very honest about what was happening to him interpersonally. But if you're grieving and you read it, you go, yeah, he got it. Yeah, he makes sense. Yeah, he does. Of all of the grief seminars I've gone to, and there's been a lot of them, whether they're Christian-based or they're not Christian-based, everybody quotes C.S. Lewis. And they have this quote. He says, I did not know that grief was so much like fear. Fear. I did not know grief was so much like fear. That's just an example of the emotional components, dimensions that we understand now of grief. Instead of just dabda, oh my gosh, this is a lot bigger. There's cognitive. People reconsider things. You know, even most of the time, even when somebody goes to a funeral home, maybe it's not their own death, family death they're associating with, but you all of a sudden people will have this moment of, maybe the important thing is really about relationships and not how much time I spend at the office and stuff like that. Grief drives you into cognitive reconsiderations about life and what's important and what do I want to do. There's somatic. That's a great word for just physical. That particular dimension, grief is I call it an energy hog. Oh my gosh, you just don't have the energy that you would normally have. It just takes so much out of you. Yeah, because under the covers, what are you doing? You're trying to figure everything out. Who am I? What does this mean? Where do I go? On and on and on and on. I could give you 100 different scenarios there. That's all happening underneath the cover. So guess what? That uses lots of energy. So you have less energy for a lot of the other things in your life. And sometimes you need to kind of say no for your own self-care. It's social. Oh my gosh, when I got divorced, it was like, all right, well, we were a couple friends with all these people. And now who's our friends and who's not our friends? What's our social world? That all just went into an uproar. Okay? Again, normal was lost. We're not going to get it back. We have to find the new normal. And I did. Then, of course, there's also spiritual dimensions we need to talk about because at its core, I think actually grief is one of the most spiritual journeys that we take. Because of all those things, we're trying to reconsider. We're trying to understand. We're trying to come to grips. And those are that's spiritual work. Believe it or not, at its core, that's spiritual work. In the first year after Jeremy died, I was with a pretty well-known international Christian leader. And, I think we talked about my situation, and I said, it's interesting. I also used to be a preacher, just so you know. Can you tell? Because I love to talk. I said, yeah, it's been so interesting because right before my son died, there was a shift in my preaching. I never denied the deity of Christ, but I started adding in the humanity of Christ and what it meant for him to be human and how we need to get something from that. Not that the exclusion, or denial of his deity. It was both. And so I go, what do you think that's all about? I mean, talk about being confused. And he looks at me and he says, Greg, he goes, maybe one of the most spiritual things we can do is try to find out what it is to be truly human the way God created us to be. That was 24 years ago. I never forgot that. Grief is an incredibly spiritual journey. So here's the important thing. If you get nothing else, if you walk away and say, Greg, he talked a lot. Here's the one thing I want you to get from today. At its core, grief is about love. Grief is a love thing, not an abnormal thing. It's a love thing. You grieve much because you love much. Love is the core of grief. So when we get messages that say, don't, stop doing it. That's wrong. Don't do that. They're telling us, stop loving. I'm sorry. I'm not going to stop loving Jeremy. I ain't giving that to anybody. I will continue to love him. That's why I never use terms like it's so when you're over it, when you're done with it, when you're past it, because that would be inappropriate to love. Love is everlasting. Will it transition? Yes, it will, and yes, it has. I had to transition from love that was based on presence to love that was based on memory and absence. But it's still love. So I see grief as an expression, actually, of love. That kind of changes the whole dimension of it, doesn't it? It's a love thing. Now, one of the nuances in some life losses, like divorce, is, well, Greg, that one really doesn't fit that one. We could talk a little bit about it, but I will say this much, just very briefly, that divorce is still about a transition. It's a transition from what I had and what I thought love was to probably not. And I got to tell you this too. This was weird since I went through both. There were parts about the life loss, the divorce, that was almost harder than the death loss because the person was still here. I had to figure that one out. It's hard. It's hard. So I did want to make that nuance, okay? And then the other thing is meaning, right? What gives us meaning? Well, when we lose something, sometimes we lose some meaning. I had meaning in making this other person happy. I love to make my wife laugh, right? That's part of my meaning, is to make her laugh. One of my purposes in life is to make her laugh. And that person's going, I've lost some meaning and purpose. So another part of grief is about, how do I find that? What's part of that new normal? I have to find new meaning and purpose. And one of my meanings and purpose after my son died was to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So that's why I do what I do. And that's why Mark puts up with me. Thank you so much, Mark. All right. See how we're doing here? All right. Myths. There's a whole series of myths, and I wanted to include this in the basics because we live with these myths. They are so ingrained in us, we sometimes have trouble doing what we know would be better to do. So I want to just hit the myths. I'll hit them quickly. Mark will give more, some additional understandings toward these. What are some classic myths? Grief and mourning are the same. Grief and mourning are not the same. Grief is what's happening internally. It's that milieu, that cauldron of emotion that's going all over the place. Man, grief takes you to emotional places you've probably never been before. Grief is internal. Mourning is external. Mourning is when we give some kind of external expression to what's going on internally. I call that congruency. When we're congruent, we both grieve and mourn. The problem is we can't always do that. There are times when we're places where we can't mourn. And so we have to be a little incongruent. We call it the mask. Everybody's going to know what that is. We have to put this mask on. When we're talking about the basics of grief and how to do grief better, it's not, are you congruent all the time? You can't. It's just not going to happen. If you give yourself permission to be congruent sometimes, when you're maybe alone, maybe when you're with safe people. I got to tell you, when people come to my office, that's where they become congruent. They cry and they yell and they do all kinds of stuff. There's this need for congruency. If you don't get a chance to be congruent, there are complications that show up. Well, I'll tell you that complication. I don't know why I just threw that out there and said, that I was going to move on. Mourning is a necessary component to moving through grief. People who grieve but do not mourn more often than not stay stuck, or it takes them an incredibly long time to work through it. There is this connection between grieving and mourning, but they are not the same thing. That's why it's so important to have safe places and safe people. And say what you need to say and cry the maybe the way you need to cry. Or yell at a person. I got mad at Jeremy. What was he doing on that highway at that time? I got mad at him. And he and I had a few words. You got to be able to do that stuff because that helps you move through your grief. You're giving your grief expression. You are acknowledging it. It's not in predictable, orderly stages. That's the DABDA thing. That's not true. It's all about a whole multiplicity of dimensions. Another myth is to avoid the pain. It's weird to be a grief counselor because we invite people into their pain. We invite them into their pain because that's where, when you actively work with it, when you're a participant in your own grief, you get to move. You get to move because you're acknowledging it and now you're working with it. Tears are weak. That's been a classic thing forever. Don't cry. That's a weak thing to do. Tears are not weak, by the way. If the tears were weak, I got to take you to, I'm from Covenant Seminary, so I had to memorize lots of scripture. Shortest verse in all of scripture, Jesus wept. 2 words. Jesus wept. So if crying is wrong, if it's weak, and I got to say Jesus was wrong and Jesus was weak, that doesn't add up to me. Maybe he was showing in his humanity what a human reaction to death is when he stood before the tomb of Lazarus. He cried. He wept. The other interesting thing is in that culture, they had the understanding, because if you read the next verse, it says, and the crowd around saw him crying, and they said, look how much he loves him. They understood it was about love. That's something wrong. It was about love. So, so one of our myths is the best thing to do is just kind of don't do any more tears, especially tears. I don't know why tears gets all the attention. Loss, another myth is loss is one-dimensional. I lost this person. The reality is loss has many dimensions. All right, and it's not just about one person. There's a whole list of secondary losses. When you lose somebody, you don't lose just them. You lose the person that was your lover. You lose the person that was your companion. You lose the person that was your confidant. You lose the person that you had, in my case, legacy set up with. Jeremy was the last of the branch of the Daniels from St. Louis. He was it. My brother, it's just me and my brother. My brother's got 2 daughters. I got a daughter. That's it. That was it. That was weird. I mean, if you asked me beforehand, would that matter? I go, no. But afterwards, did it? Yeah. Because that was a whole nother thing that he had. He had the name. So there's a lot of secondary losses. Some people, it's a chauffeur and a banker. All kinds of stuff. There's not just one thing we lost. There's a multiplicity. Secondary losses, we call them. People will tell you this is another myth that you can get back to normal. You will never get back to normal. How's that for just laying it on the line for you? Normal is gone. Yet everybody talks about, I just want to get back to normal. My 21-year-old granddaughter wants to get back to normal, but she's not gonna. It's not going to happen. And then another one is you're going to get over your grief. You do not get over your grief. Now, please don't hear that as me being Debbie Downer, if you know that particular character. You do not get over your grief. However, your grief does soften. I got to tell you, my grief now is not exactly the same kind of grief that I had 24 years ago. I had an extended period of time of intense grief. And then it began to soften and change. And you know how it did that? I looked at it, I acknowledged it, and I started to work with it. That's why I like Alan Wolfelt. He was saying the same thing I was saying when I met him. You can't avoid it. You got to work with it to find your way. So you don't get over it. You also don't get over it because of love. Love doesn't do that. Love doesn't go, oh, they're gone. Huh, okay, I'll move on. It's not the way love works, right? And if grief is about love, then why do we think, that it's going to be, there's going to be a day when it's all done. It won't even matter that that person ever existed in my life. Yeah, well, yes, it will. I do have to this day, to just give you the full picture, my intense grief. I've been softened from that. I still have grief bursts, we call them. Grief bursts are, there's some surprise, something happens. It takes me right back to it all for just a minute. And it's almost like I'm right back there. And then I kind of come back. Those are called grief bursts. They're a for real thing, and they'll happen the rest of my life. And sometimes, depending on where it happens, sometimes people might go, you see that? He's not over it. And you're absolutely right on that. They will say it in a demeaning way. I say it out of love. You're right. I'm not over it. So those are some of the basic myths. Mark, would you be willing to add to that? I think you have some great insights.
To touch on some of these from my perspective is the idea that grief and mourning are the same. To Greg's point, it helps us to move through the process of grief. Mourning is externalizing what's going on inside. And so, yeah, it's one of those things that help us move through our grief, to be able to externalize, to be able to share, helps us to move past the pain. Predictable stages. We're all unique individuals. And so everybody's grief will be unique. And this is important when it comes to like comparing your grief with others or vice versa, feeling like you should be grieving a certain way when people are around. Your relationship was unique. You're unique. And so it doesn't help to compare our grief. I say this to people that when my wife passed, I actually came alive. And I say that because I felt so much pain, I knew I was alive. And so the pain was such that I experienced emotions I had never known before, early 40s. And so with the emotions, I didn't know what to do with those things, emotions. And so, yeah, there's some unpredictable things that will happen in our grief process. Greg talked about inviting you into your pain. The idea of grieve well, when I mention that to clients, they kind of look at me kind of weird, like grief is the torment of the soul. It's a broken heart. How do you do that well? And that would be to allow yourself to feel the pain. The saying that says to love well, you must feel. To live fully, you must be able to feel fully. And that's what grief is, allowing yourself to feel fully. And what I like to do with clients is really to reframe the idea of pain, because we are so avoidant. Our culture is so avoidant. It's looked upon as negative. We don't want pain humanly. We avoid pain. I do. But to begin to reframe pain, the idea of pain when it comes to grief, and that is to see the pain as being sacred. That pain that you are feeling means something very holy. It's very significant. It represents meaning, as Greg alluded to. And so trying to reframe this so that we don't suppress it, we don't avoid it, we don't numb it, we don't distract ourselves totally from it, but that we do give ourselves to that. Tears show weakness. That's something that about a year after she passed, I looked back and I regretted because I have two kids. They were 9 and 11 at the time. No, 9 and 12. They were 9 and 12 at the time. And I grieved in private. I wept in private. And I didn't let them, my children, see me weep. I didn't model for them what it meant to grieve. And so tears aren't a sign of weakness. They're a sign of love. And in hindsight, I wish I would have been more visual in sharing my tears with them. Loss is one-dimensional. Greg's mentioned this. Our identity is shaken. We are no longer married. We are single. What does that mean? Some of us have been married more than we've been single in our life. And so there's a whole idea of like, what does it mean to be single? That is very intimidating. It's very scary. And so that takes a real hit as far as who we are, who our person is. It rocks our confidence. Sometimes they're our biggest fan. They're the ones rooting us on. We lose our synergism as far as being able to share ideas, make decisions, bounce things off of them, and be able to come up with an answer or a decision. And that is lost. We're alone. We have other people, but we're alone. Coming back to the different levels of loss, that person might have been our protector. You mentioned anger, sense of security, that's lost as well. Social network. People get together as couples. No longer invited. That's very isolating. It's a reminder of the loss. And so the whole social dynamic will change. And that's a loss. And just our hopes and our dreams that we had made together, anticipated, expected, are now shattered. And so just the idea of our dreams of not being fulfilled is another loss. So there's so many losses when we lose a person, a spouse, that we're reminded of throughout the years. It's unfortunate. Back to normal, there is no normal. And I think when it comes to normal, what we're looking for is predictability. There's so many unknowns when we lose a spouse, trying to learn our new identity. It's like a wilderness. What is this wilderness? How do I move through this wilderness of unknowns of what this means to be single? And so some of that is a process that we're going to be talking about here. And getting over your grief, it does soften. And I think what we're trying to do is trying to transition what this new looks like. There's a transition, but there's also a transformation. That if you let the pain do what it needs to do, that feeling of pain, it will transform you in the process and make you a different person. And so grief will happen. You guys alluded to it. If we don't do it well, if we don't embrace it, if we don't process it, it will come out in anxiety. It will come out in depression. It will come out in addictions. It'll come out in different ways. I've worked with people that have carried grief for 10, 15 years, not dealing with it. They've just avoided it. They've distracted themselves. And so by you embracing these hard feelings, naming some of the things that you've lost. You're actually giving space and letting yourself process these things. And that's what we're talking about as far as transition into some of these. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you, Mark. That's awesome. Beautiful. And that is exactly it. That's our, hopefully we've done good on time. That is exactly what it's about. Grief and mourning is about making room, or maybe even giving yourself permission. Because these myths that I brought up, they're ingrained. They tell us not to do this stuff. Avoid it. Come up with some platitudes. And they are so ingrained with us. And so sometimes we have to remind ourselves and give ourselves permission to do something that might seem intuitively the opposite of what it should be. And this is one of the things that when I looked at grief and from a bigger perspective, I realized grief is one great big paradox. You get better by feeling worse. What sense does that make? So if we're going to talk about something that's spiritual at its core, when I look at least at my faith and my understanding of scripture, there's lots of paradox. First shall be last, the last shall be first. If you want to be a great leader, be a great servant, on and on and on and on. It's a huge paradox. And so that's why it makes sense if you think in terms of paradox to then this is going to be weird. Are you ready? How do I befriend my pain? Boy, I got to tell you, when people sit in my office and we start talking about that, they're like, what's wrong with you? Last thing I want to do is befriend it. Yet, that is almost the call. To acknowledge it, to work with it. Because that's what helps us move. So if you're getting, so here's the second thing I want to make sure everybody got. It's about love and don't avoid. It's the avoidance that winds up causing most of the problems that Mark and I will see. It's about that avoidance. And don't totally distract. You do, though, once in a while have to distract. It's okay. Take a break. If you try to do your grief 24/7, you're going to wear yourself out. It's okay. I took what was it? A little over a month after Jeremy died. Yeah, I went to a cabin in the woods for a little while with my wife and another couple, and we hiked. Did my grief go with me? Yes, it did. Did it give me a little bit of a break? Yes. It's okay to do that. But to do that totally, that's a whole different story. You're going to just take all your time trying to be so busy that you don't have to look at it, because grief will keep trying to call out to you. We'll keep trying to do that. That's not the life I want for you today. So it's about giving yourself permission to integrate the grief. That's what I call it. Integrating it means how do I make this loss now a part of my life in a way that I can live with, and that can be a transformative process. I'm no longer the same person. I'm no longer the same Greg DeVille after my son died that I was before. And if I tried to be the same one before, shame on me. Him being gone should change me. Transition. So our goal, as you probably picked up, is not to. When we get back together, we're going to talk about healing and moving. How do we process grief? That's what the next session will be about. It will not be about how do I make it all go away. Otherwise, I would have to sit here and say my goal is to make my son go away. That is not my goal. As a matter of fact, maybe that might be profoundly wrong. So it's really, I've just learned this recently with a discussion with my 21-year-old granddaughter. This whole processing thing to work toward healing everything, it's really about managing how the grief is going to change you. About working with the grief in such a way, well, who do I want to be now? I can't be the same person. Who do I want to be? Right? grief processing is really about managing how the grief is going to change you. Of course, we want it to change us in ways that honor the person and honor ourselves, honor our Lord. That's what really happens in it all. So I look forward to being able to see you all again, hopefully, for the second session that we're going to have. I want to thank Fran for, wow, even making this possible. You know, they really care. I love these people, they care. I'm really impressed. Thank you.
I had to be very gracious towards people because, like you said, there's different types of people out there. Some people will avoid you because they don't know how to interact with that hurt, that pain. And some people have good intentions. They try, but it really does not hurt. It doesn't help the situation. It makes it worse. And I have to be gracious to them. Realizing that they don't know what I'm experiencing. But there are people out there that do get it. And those are the people I want to surround myself with. Those are the ones that are a help. And I need those people. But I think to your question, I don't have enough energy to try and correct them. I just need to move on and be gracious. So, kind of like beware.
I would agree with that. There's this, I use the term gracious griever. It doesn't seem fair, does it? You're the one that's grieving, but then you have to use the energy to be gracious because somebody doesn't get it, you know, and you're right, it's not fair. However, you kind of have to be the gracious griever because people don't get what they don't get. It's really hard, you know, to take everybody on. Now, I will say, for me, when people, well, here's the classic. When people would say, "Well, you know, he's in a better place." I'm gonna let that one sit for a while, right? He's in a better place. Yeah, I knew that, but I hurt because he's not here. Why do I hurt? Because I love. What does love do? Love calls out for the presence of somebody. When I love somebody, I want them with me. I want to be with them, right? And so what I did was I looked at the relationship, and for just most people, I would say, "Oh, okay, thank you." And just was the gracious griever, you know. For those few, it was a very few. And I'm glad you brought up this education part. Very few that I felt so close to. I could say he is, and it's true, but that's not helpful for me because I'm grieving more. In other words, and this is a great big topic, I took it out of either or, and I made it both and. I can both acknowledge he's in a better place, but I can also and grieve the fact that he's not here with me. Because that's what love calls out for. Kept bringing it back to love. Back to love. Good question. Thank you. Oh, that's a good question. Part of that is when we're aware, we're at that point that we're the one that's dying, we almost have to grieve our own death. So a lot of this does apply because you need to grieve the fact now I'll be gone. And so I think that's a starting point. And that, so I think that's how it applies. You're not the survivor. However, you have to grieve your own death. And then, for me anyway, how to say this, I'm just gonna be blunt if I can say that. I'm getting older, so I'm at that stage of life where I'm thinking, you know, I'm not gonna be around forever. Right? And I start thinking in terms of, so what do I want to leave behind? And how do I want to care well for the people that are going to be left behind? One of the things I know I'm going to do is I'm going to write my own funeral, not because I'm egotistical, but because I know my daughter won't get it quite all of it. And so I want to make sure that I'm creating something that will allow her the room and the permission to do all the grieving things that I know she'll need to do, and she just doesn't know it at this point. I would add that nuance.
One thing that in seminary that really stood out to me was that we're always taught there's no wrong question. In seminary, they kind of flipped that a little bit and said there's better questions. And so some of that might be instead of asking why, asking what. And so in the process, make sure you're asking a question that helps you. That makes sense. That doesn't lead you down a path that there's no answer.
Most definitely. Did we address you well? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Yeah. Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Thanks. So what do? Number one, you don't try to fix it. You are dealing with the unfixable. So why do we try to fix it? And isn't that a whole lot of these platitudes and things are? He's in a better place. Yes, but they're just trying to fix it, right? This is not the fixable one. Jesus stood before the tomb of Lazarus and wept. He didn't say, "Oh, by the way, I don't have to do anything because I'm going to reason here and fix it." He sat in it. So I'm so impressed you used even the term "sitting it." That is exactly what you do. You sit in it. Job's friends were great friends when they sat with him. There only started to be problems when they started trying to fix it for him. Well, what did you do, Job? There must be something to the. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So I would say number one, you have to lay down that thing that's inside of all of us to fix. I need to fix it. No, this is not fixable in that way. Acknowledge what's going on. And sometimes sacred silence does more than speaking. It's about being present. Just being present with somebody. And I liked how, Mark, you said earlier about sacred. That becomes a sacred thing. So let me make sure I've got the question right. How do we counsel people who don't have the hope of the resurrection and being able to see somebody again? Okay. That hurts my soul. And that isn't part of somebody. I hate to jump in. No, you're okay. Yeah, I mean, it's just if a person doesn't believe it, it's just really from a counseling standpoint. Now, from a Christian standpoint, there's other things I can do, but from the counseling standpoint, you just really can't go there other than to come back to, well, this is about love. And I find a lot of people believe in love and not be Christians. So we come back to love, which is actually an expression of God, and the love part of all of this. And then how do you keep your relationship with that person? How do you move into a new relationship with that person? That becomes more of the emphasis, if you will. Because they're going to have to go with that person for the rest of their life, in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, I mean, I have quite a few that I go to. And you bring up a really interesting point. Scripture is full of that. And we don't really see it until we need to see it, right? And even to the point of being able to say in Isaiah, where he talks about the coming of the Christ, he's a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Now, I don't want to just take that word grief too much because different translations are going to, call that something else. But the point of it is, he's a man of sorrows, and he understands our human condition as pain. Isn't that interesting, So to try to be more like Christ might be, actually. Now you probably understand that term I used earlier a little better, a little more. befriending your grief. It's a hard one. It's a hard one for people to get, but I think you really kind of did a good job saying that. Why? Answering that, why would I want to do that? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't necessarily have a list of scriptures. It's almost like they're there when you need them, type of thing. The Lord just kind of like pops the scripture and he speaks. Yeah, I'm thinking of like how we want to get past our grief, but we don't want to forget. And that tension of like getting past the pain, but not wanting to get past the pain, if that makes sense. But the intensity of what like, so yeah.
Yeah, that's the number one fear. Did you know that? Usually of people who are grieving, that they're going to forget them. Or that other people are going to forget them. And I was in, I'll take a, oh, I'm going to tell a quick story. Is it okay? Okay, all right. I'm going to tell a quick story. I was in Israel, spent some time in Israel. I was actually with, her husband taught at the Haifa Institute. And while I was with her in Israel, her husband was meeting with Barack Obama on some Middle East scenario. So that's how connected this person was. And she got us into places no, we would never be able to go get in. Went with Jared Bars, by the way. So yeah, spent a week with Jared Bars in Israel. So we went to the Golan Heights, and there's all kinds of monuments and stuff there. You know, most of you are going to know what the Golan Heights are about, you know, the wars, and you have to be careful because there's still landmines and all kinds of stuff. And so I went and did all that. I came back, and so Bonnie said, "So Greg, did you see all the monuments and stuff?" So, yeah, I did. Okay. Did you see all the inscriptions? I go, yeah, there's lots of people's names. And she kept looking at me, and I kept looking at her, you know, with this awkwardness. And I go, "Fine, you're trying to get me to get something here. What are you trying to get me to get?" And she said this. She said, "Greg, in our faith," because she's Jewish, she said, "In our faith, a person's not really gone till you stop using them." And I went, "Oh my gosh, Bonnie, you're so right. They're not really gone until we stop using them." Scripture is replete with the names of people, the cloud of witnesses. So out of that, I would say, keep using their name. Here I am 24 years later, and I still talk about Jeremy. And I'll probably talk about him till the day that I don't.
Yeah, move slower. Because their bandwidth, you alluded to it, they're processing so much. And so grief, if they're working a 40-hour week, you can almost double that as far as the energy that they're expending. Grief just sucks up a ton of energy. And so there were times where I felt a little bit intoxicated. Like emotionally, I was not stable. It was a real feeling. And so there's a sense that there's a chemical imbalance going on in us as we grieve. And so just being aware that decision making will be slower. It needs to be slower. And their bandwidth of being able to take in information is going to be limited for some things. Yeah.
I would just say mourn with those who mourn. Everything else to that in life is then go rejoice with those who rejoice. I make sure I do both, just so you know. I don't spend all my time in grief. I have things I do that bring me great joy. And I say l'chaim, you know, it's a great thing, right? So you have to do both. You have to do both. But the appropriate thing, somebody who's mourning, is mourn with them. You mourn with them. Acknowledge it and know. And I love that. Absolutely. That was so practical. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. The relationship. So let's talk about depression. DAB, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did not mean clinical depression. What she meant was a sadness, a deep, intense sadness. This is what Thomas Kempis was referring to. There are times for appropriate sorrows of the soul. When we move into clinical depression, now we're talking about something biological because it's a serotonin level. And so when something moves into that level of clinical, medication is appropriate. And that's usually what helps. Actually, using the medication helps the person process their grief, because the serotonin comes back up, and serotonin is what is the brain chemistry that says, here's how you keep things in balance. So that allows them to process their grief. When I'm working with somebody that obviously has moved that way, when we talk about medication, be honest with you. Now, not everybody does. I'm not saying just because you grieve, you are going to be depressed. Many people do not. It just depends, because like Mark brought up the point, everybody's unique. Therefore, your grief is unique. Therefore, what happens with you physiologically is going to be unique. So many people don't. But in our culture, we have a tendency to take intense sadness and call it depression. And it's not. It's only clinical depression when there's a serotonin drop. And at that point, you have to really address that in order to then do good grief work.
I can just touch on that anger a little bit. There's an anger of losing our loved one, and so it comes out in different ways. And so it could be, I'm not saying this is, but it could be like you're angry that your husband's not here. It's kind of, you're putting your anger on those people that weren't there for you. There's just like anger there.
And I think in some very pertinent ways, there's a place where you wind up kind of having to even be a gracious griever about that, because you don't know what was going on. But I think the other more internal, interpersonal thing is, okay, how do I even forgive that? And I don't believe in sloppy agape, I call it. Okay, I'm just going to forgive them. No, what do I need to do to be able to forgive them and move past this? Because you want to do that for you, not for them. It's not about letting them off of a hook, all right? It's about, what do I need to do for my own good self-care right now? Because I'm sensitive, I'm vulnerable. So I need to be very slow with it and realize, yeah, it could be something disrespectful. But what do I need? It might not be a bad idea for you to have somebody help you through that. And I'm not trying to make a job for me, trust me. I am not trying to do that. But no, that's a big deal.
Definitely entertain it. And I'll just say, just to lay the groundwork for that, is it's going to be different for everybody. Because my wife, my current wife, is very gracious, and I've had God's blessed me with two amazing women, and so I could just say my wife's been very gracious, and so, but yeah, right now they're 24 and 22, yeah, and so God has been really gracious as far as just helping them. So, yeah. Thank you for bringing that.